Dylan Carter had always believed his life in Ember Pines was simple but meaningful. The small town nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests was a place where everyone knew each other, and life moved at a slower, predictable pace. Dylan, a spirited 17-year-old, lived with his parents, Mark and Sarah, in a cozy house just on the edge of town. Mark worked as a carpenter, and Sarah ran a small bakery that the town adored. They were not wealthy, but they had each other, and that was enough. Dylan often dreamed of going to college someday to study engineering, but for now his days were filled with school, helping his mom in the bakery, and playing basketball with his friends. On a dry summer evening, a storm rolled in, bringing not rain but lightning. Dylan and his family watched from their porch as the strikes illuminated the horizon. They had no idea the sparks would ignite a nightmare. By midnight, the wildfire had grown out of control, fueled by strong winds and the dry conditions. Evacuation orders spread through town, sirens blaring as families scrambled to flee. The Carters packed what little they could into their old station wagon. The flames, bright and furious, painted the night sky a terrifying orange as smoke filled the air. The chaos of the evacuation was overwhelming. Roads were clogged with cars, and people were panicking. Dylan held on to Max, the family's loyal German shepherd, while his parents tried to stay calm. "We're going to make it," Mark reassured, though fear flickered in his eyes. But as they drove through the forested outskirts, a falling tree blocked the road ahead, forcing them to turn back. The fire was closing in on all sides. In the chaos, Dylan was separated from his parents. Mark and Sarah insisted he take Max and run toward a nearby river, the only safe place left. They promised to find him, but deep down, Dylan knew they might not make it. Tears streamed down his face as he ran, clutching Max's leash, the heat of the fire biting at his heels. When he finally reached the riverbank, he turned back, but all he could see was a wall of fire consuming everything in its path. By dawn, the wildfire had burned through most of Ember Pines. Dylan, soot-covered and trembling, sat by the river with Max. Rescue workers eventually found him and took him to an emergency shelter. There, he learned the devastating truth. His parents had not survived. The fire had claimed their home, their bakery, and everything they had built together. Dylan's world crumbled. He was alone. The days that followed were a blur of grief and disbelief. Dylan stayed at the shelter, surrounded by other survivors who had lost their homes and loved ones. The once vibrant town of Ember Pines was now a smoldering wasteland. Relief efforts poured in, but no amount of food or blankets could fill the void left by his parents' absence. Dylan clung to Max, the only family he had left, as he tried to piece together what to do next. One afternoon, while helping volunteers sift through the rubble of what used to be his home, Dylan stumbled upon a fireproof safe. It was partially buried under charred wood and ash, but it was intact. The safe had always been in his parents' bedroom, and Dylan had never seen it opened. Curiosity mixed with a sense of desperation as he pried it open with a crowbar borrowed from a relief worker. Inside, he found a collection of documents, most of which were scorched around the edges. Among them was an envelope marked with his name in his mother's handwriting. Hands trembling, he opened it to find a birth certificate he'd never seen before. His heart raced as he read the names listed under parents, William and Eleanor Hastings. They were not the names of the people who had raised him. Confusion and disbelief washed over him. Who were William and Eleanor Hastings? Why had his parents never told him about this? Dylan's mind raced with questions, but there were no answers. He found another document tucked behind the birth certificate, a handwritten letter from his mother. In it, she explained everything. Dylan had been adopted as a baby, though not through any traditional means. His biological parents, the Hastings, were an incredibly wealthy and influential couple who had thought their infant son had been lost in a tragic accident. Dylan read the letter over and over, struggling to process the truth. His parents had planned to tell him someday, but they hadn't wanted it to overshadow the loving life they had built together. Sarah's words were full of love and reassurance. "You've always been our son, Dylan. No amount of wealth or status could ever change that. But if you're reading this, it means we're no longer with you. Follow your heart and never forget where you came from." In the days that followed, Dylan's grief mingled with a new sense of purpose. He decided he needed to find out more about the Hastings and uncover the truth about his origins. With Max by his side, he began a journey that would take him far from the ashes of Ember Pines and into a world he never could have imagined. Dylan's journey began with a simple search on the worn-out computer in the shelter's common area. Typing William and Eleanor Hastings, into the search bar yielded hundreds of results. They were not just wealthy, they were among the most prominent figures in the country. William Hastings was the CEO of a multinational corporation specializing in cutting-edge technology, and Eleanor Hastings was a philanthropist known for her work in education and disaster relief. Their faces graced magazine covers, and their achievements were the stuff of legend. The idea that he could be connected to these larger-than-life figures felt impossible. He found an address for the Hastings family lawyer, a man named Robert Calloway, whose name had also been mentioned in his mother's letter. With nothing to lose, Dylan used what little money he had to buy a bus ticket to the city where Calloway's office was located. It was a long ride, and every mile away from Ember Pines felt like stepping into the unknown. When Dylan arrived at the towering office building downtown, he felt out of place in his worn-out sneakers and smoke-stained hoodie. Still, he walked through the glass doors and approached the receptionist. "I need to speak with Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. The receptionist raised an eyebrow, but made a call. Moments later, Dylan was ushered into an opulent office where Robert Calloway sat behind a mahogany desk. Calloway was a sharp-eyed man in his 60s, with a demeanor that radiated authority. He listened intently as Dylan explained his story, showing the birth certificate and letter as proof. At first, the lawyer seemed skeptical, but something in Dylan's earnestness made him take the claim seriously. "This is highly unusual," Calloway said, studying the documents. "But the evidence is compelling. If what you're saying is true, this could change everything." He arranged for a DNA test, and the results came back a week later. The match was undeniable. Dylan Carter was, in fact, the long-lost son of William and Eleanor Hastings. Calloway, now fully convinced, began making arrangements for Dylan to meet his biological parents. Dylan's mind swirled with emotions, excitement, fear, and a lingering sense of betrayal. What would the Hastings be like? Would they accept him? Did he even want to be part of their world? When the day of the meeting arrived, Dylan found himself standing in front of the massive iron gates of the Hastings estate. The mansion beyond was like something out of a movie, its grandeur both awe-inspiring and intimidating. As the gates opened, Dylan took a deep breath and stepped forward, Max trotting faithfully at his side. He was about to walk into a life he never could have imagined, leaving behind the ashes of the only world he had ever known. The gates swung open with a quiet hum, revealing a winding driveway lined with immaculately trimmed hedges and towering oak trees. Dylan's eyes widened as the mansion came into full view. It wasn't just a house, it was a palace. The sprawling estate boasted marble columns, massive glass windows, and perfectly landscaped gardens. For a moment, he felt like he had stepped into another world entirely, one so far removed from the life he had known in Ember Pines that it felt almost unreal. As he walked toward the entrance, Max stayed close, his ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. Dylan's heart pounded as the massive double doors swung open, revealing a butler who greeted him with a polite nod. "Mr. Dylan Carter, Mr. and Mrs. Hastings are expecting you. Please, follow me." The interior of the mansion was even more breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, and every surface gleamed with polished wood or pristine marble. Priceless artwork adorned the walls, and the faint scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Dylan felt small, insignificant, as he followed the butler through the grand halls. Finally, they entered a sunlit sitting room where two figures stood waiting. William Hastings was a tall, imposing man with sharp features and an air of authority. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to assess Dylan with a single glance. Eleanor Hastings, in contrast, exuded warmth. Her kind eyes softened the sharp lines of her face, and her elegant dress spoke of effortless sophistication. She stepped forward first, her hands clasped tightly together as if trying to contain her emotions. "Dylan," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It's so wonderful to finally meet you." Dylan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He wasn't sure what to say or how to feel. This was his biological mother, the woman who had given him life, yet she felt like a stranger. William stepped forward, his expression more guarded. "You've had quite the journey to get here," he said. "We're glad you did." Eleanor reached out hesitantly, and Dylan allowed her to pull him into a gentle hug. It felt strange, unfamiliar, but there was a sincerity in her embrace that he couldn't ignore. William extended a hand, and Dylan shook it, feeling the strength in the man's grip. "There's much to discuss," William said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But first, let's get you settled. You're home now." Home. The word echoed in Dylan's mind, feeling both comforting and alien. Could this place, with its grandeur and wealth, ever truly be home? Could these people, despite their blood connection, ever feel like family? As the butler led him to a lavish guest room, Dylan couldn't help but wonder if he'd traded one set of uncertainties for another. Dylan spent his first night in the Hastings estate in a room larger than his entire house back in Ember Pines. The bed was impossibly soft, and the walls were adorned with artwork he didn't recognize but could tell was worth more than anything he had ever owned. Despite the luxury, Dylan couldn't sleep. His mind churned with questions about his new life, his past, and the parents he had lost. Max, curled up at the foot of the bed, provided the only sense of familiarity. The next morning, a knock on the door startled Dylan. A member of the staff informed him that breakfast was ready, and Dylan reluctantly followed them to the dining room. There, Eleanor greeted him warmly, but William's presence was more subdued. The conversation was polite but strained. "We've arranged for a tutor to help you acclimate," William announced over coffee, his tone matter-of-fact. "There's a lot you'll need to learn about our world." Dylan bristled at the idea of being treated like a project, but he nodded. "I appreciate it," he replied, though the words felt hollow. Over the following weeks, Dylan struggled to adapt. The Hastings world was a whirlwind of business meetings, galas, and endless expectations. Eleanor did her best to make Dylan feel welcome, often spending time with him in the garden or sharing stories about his infancy. William, however, remained distant, his interactions with Dylan mostly focused on teaching him the family's legacy and preparing him to eventually take over the empire. Dylan's frustration grew. He felt like an outsider in a world that demanded perfection, and his grief over his adoptive parents never truly left him. One evening, after an especially tense dinner where William criticized Dylan for not being assertive enough, Dylan stormed out to the garden, Max following closely behind. "I don't belong here," he muttered to himself, sitting on a bench. The stars above seemed dimmer than he remembered in Ember Pines. "I never asked for any of this." Eleanor found him there, her steps quiet but purposeful. "I know this isn't easy," she said, sitting beside him. "But you're stronger than you think. Your parents, Mark and Sarah, raised you to be resilient. That's why you're here, Dylan." Dylan looked at her, surprised. "You don't resent them for taking me away?" "Never," Eleanor said firmly. "They loved you, and they kept you safe. That's all we could have hoped for." Her words planted a seed of understanding in Dylan, though his path to accepting his new reality was still uncertain. As he navigated his new life, he began to realize that his presence in the Hastings family wasn't just about him. It was an opportunity to bridge two worlds and honor the values his adoptive parents had instilled in him. Dylan's turning point came one afternoon when Eleanor invited him to join her at a community event. She was overseeing a project funded by the Hastings Foundation to rebuild homes for wildfire survivors in a neighboring region. Seeing the devastation mirrored in other families' lives was like stepping back into the ashes of Ember Pines. It stirred something deep within Dylan, a desire to help. Eleanor noticed his quiet reflection as they walked among the volunteers. "This is why we do what we do," she said. "To give people hope." Dylan nodded, his thoughts racing. He began to see a way to make sense of his new life and honor the memory of the parents who had raised him. That evening, he approached William in the study, a place he had avoided until now. "I have an idea," Dylan began, his voice steady. William looked up from his desk, intrigued but skeptical. "I want to start a program, a disaster relief initiative to help families affected by wildfires. Not just rebuilding homes, but providing long-term support for recovery." William raised an eyebrow. "That's a noble goal," he said, "but it's not as simple as it sounds." "I know," Dylan said, his determination evident, "but I want to try. I've lived through it. I know what it's like to lose everything." For the first time, William seemed to regard Dylan with genuine respect. "Then let's make it happen," he said. Over the following months, Dylan threw himself into the project. With the support of the Hastings Foundation, he launched the Ember Initiative, a comprehensive disaster relief program aimed at providing housing, counseling, and education for families affected by wildfires. The work was demanding, but deeply fulfilling. For the first time since the fire, Dylan felt a sense of purpose. At the program's launch event, Dylan stood on stage before a crowd of donors, survivors, and volunteers. He spoke about his journey, from the ashes of Ember Pines to finding a new family and a new mission. "This isn't just about rebuilding homes," he said. "It's about rebuilding lives." And it's about hope. Eleanor beamed with pride, and even William offered a rare smile. Dylan knew he still had much to learn and many challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he belonged. Not just in the Hastings family, but in the world they were trying to change for the better. As the audience erupted in applause, Dylan glanced at Max, sitting faithfully by his side. Together, they had weathered the storm, and together, they would help others do the same.